Hiya, this is WaterLily6519 again, and today's video is somewhat different. I'm going to be reading one of my stories, but this video will also be an anti-bullying type of video because I just want to get the message out there that bullying at any point is not okay. This is something that can happen, what I'm about to read in my story. I just want to put out a disclaimer that this story tells about very, very upsetting topics. So if you're not comfortable with bullying, talks about getting threats like go ahead and kill yourself or suicide, don't watch this video, because I just want to get this out there that bullying is never all right. So with that disclaimer out the way, I'm going to start reading my story, River. Lindsay straightened up and placed a few wisps of hair behind her ear. It was February and freezing outside. I hope the judges will like it. The forest river in winter dress, she said to herself, wiping off the paintbrush and putting it back with her painting equipment. She looked at the canvas and smiled a satisfied smile. Lindsay had been painting for 4 hours, and the half-frozen river oversprayed her with freezing river foam constantly. She was very pleased, but by now it was time to go home. The oil paint had dried by now, despite the river foam. She wrapped the painting in a cloth and packed all her painting equipment. She then picked up the load and walked home at a brisk pace. Once she got home, Lindsay found a note on the door. Had to pick up papers at the office. Back in 45 minutes, it read. It was from her older sister, Margaret. Lindsay unlocked the door and went inside. The sisters had been living alone ever since their parents lost their lives in a motor vehicle accident 3 years prior. Margaret was employed as a secretary at a law firm and provided for herself and Lindsay, who was still in high school. Lindsay quickly put on dinner and checked her mobile whilst waiting. She felt a sharp sting of pain deep inside when she read what it said. Thank you for cooking dinner, Lindsay, Margaret said when she came home. Lindsay placed the dinner on the table, and they both knelt by the short table on the Japanese mats. I finished my painting. The forest in winter dress is perfect now, Lindsay said as they did the washing up. Great. Just remember to not be too disappointed if you don't win, Margaret said, placing the last plate back in the china cupboard. Lindsay gave her a nudge and went downstairs to her art room to do her homework. That night, Lindsay cried herself to sleep. She thought about the messages she had received. It hurt, and she stared at the painting she had brought upstairs from her art room. The water looked so peaceful. Maybe I should. She broke herself off and fell asleep. The next morning, Lindsay walked to school bright and early. Walking quickly, she arrived at her school 45 minutes early. There were only a couple of teachers and a boy in the aula, so Lindsay quickly found a good spot. She put up the easel and placed her painting on it. What a beautiful painting, came a voice from behind. Lindsay turned around and saw Matthew standing behind her, sweet Matthew whom she'd been in love with since kindergarten. He had put up an easel next to her and was busy unwrapping a painting from a piece of cloth. How gorgeous, Lindsay exclaimed when Matthew displayed his artwork. The painting showed the old oak in the sunset, a silhouette against a flaming light. I painted it yesterday. I only had 45 minutes to paint the picture, but I managed to do it, he said, pointing at the tiny brush strokes that gave depth to the painted sunlight. Lindsay admired the beautiful painting and felt a blushing creep across her face. I hope you win, Matthew. You deserve it, she said, giving Matthew a smile. Matthew smiled back and replied, I hope you win. The painting looks so incredibly realistic. Lindsay smiled proudly as the judges viewed her painting. How lifelike. It is a rare gem to the eye, said one of the judges and gave Lindsay a wide smile. Lindsay thanked them and watched as the judges viewed Matthew's painting. Matthew thanked them for the admiration, but Lindsay spotted a sad look in his eyes. Is something the matter, Matthew? She asked Matthew, who quickly wiped his eyes with his hand. I was just thinking about my parents. They died 3 years ago In a motor vehicle accident. I live with my older brother Harold, Matthew replied, snivelling slightly. Lindsay put her hand on Matthew's shoulder. My condolences, she muttered. I understand how you feel. I also lost my parents 3 years ago in the same kind of accident. My older sister is the only one I have left other than our grandparents. Matthew placed his hand on top of Lindsay's and muttered, my condolences. Lindsay felt her eyes welling up with tears, and she began to cry. Matthew put his arms around her and stroked the back of her head whilst gently shushing. Lindsay let her forehead recline on his shoulder and let her tears stream. Matthew kept stroking the back of her head over and over. After some time, Lindsay pulled back and blushed. I'm sorry, Matthew, I couldn't stop myself from crying, she said, slightly embarrassed. Matthew just shrugged and stepped closer to Lindsay. This is something I wanted to tell you ever since kindergarten, Matthew said in a hushed tone and leaned closer. Lindsay felt a flush crossing her face and leaned against the wall behind her. I love you, Lindsay, Matthew said in the same hushed tone, lifted her chin and gazed deep into her eyes. Lindsay lifted her hand and rested it on his cheek whilst leaning closer. Matthew followed her example and kissed her warmly and passionately. At first, Lindsay was unsure if she really wanted to kiss him, but her lips softened and started kissing him back. Matthew leaned even closer yet and kissed her even warmer. What neither of them knew was that they were being watched by Eric and Eileen. They were the worst bullies in school and were responsible for the worst bullying of Lindsay. They whispered to one another and smiled wickedly. Eric pulled out his mobile and began texting. Eileen snapped photos in secret and both snickered at what they did. I knew you'd win, Lindsay, Matthew said, squeezing Lindsay's hand. Lindsay smiled happily and looked at her trophy. Matthew had won second place and both were more than happy. They separated at the crossroads, but Matthew promised to come over to Lindsay as soon as he had placed his things at home and told his brother where he was going. Lindsay ran home on light feet and locked herself in her house. Her mobile had been going haywire ever since she had kissed Matthew, so she placed her bag and trophy on her desk, looked at her mobile, and collapsed in the middle of the floor. Now it had indeed come to this. You're a worthless human. He doesn't really love you. It was all just fake. And many more hurtful messages were rapidly showing up on the mobile screen. Lindsay felt the urge to cry pressing inside her chest, and the tears started flooding out of her eyes. She tried to breathe, but her breath got stuck and became hysterical hiccups and a few sobs. She wrapped her arms around her chest and rocked back and forth. Finally, Lindsay managed to calm down so she could get up. She threw her mobile onto her bed and grabbed her hair before stopping dead still. I know what I have to do, she said to herself and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. Lindsay quickly wrote down a message, kissed the note and adhered it to the front door. Then she made sure the door locked itself behind her, ran into the forest and didn't stop until she came to the edge of the river. Lindsay looked around to make sure no one was around. Then she turned her face toward the river and let the ice-cold river foam mix with her warm tears. Matthew walked up the stairs to Lindsay's house and spotted the note. His name was written on it, so he took it. His brother, who had come along, gave Matthew a questioning look. Matthew shook his head unknowingly and unfolded the note to read what was written on it. Dear Matthew, when you read this, I have already left. I have been bullied for several years, and now the cup is overflowing. Therefore, I will go to the place I painted and end my suffering there. Farewell, my beloved Matthew, the note read with a pink lipstick mark next to the message. Matthew felt a hand of ice grab his heart. Lindsay was going to kill herself. Harold, you have to come with me to the river, Matthew shouted and started running as fast as he could toward the forest. If only it's not too late, Matthew thought and sped up even more. By the edge of the river, he skidded to a halt and looked downstream. There was Lindsay. She was being led downstream and bumped against smaller ice flakes. She was face down in the water, and Matthew threw off his jacket and jumped into the icy water and started swimming toward her. He was strong and finally managed to reach Lindsay and grabbed her. Lindsay wasn't moving and her face was deathly pale. Matthew swam toward the riverbank and managed to grab hold of a tree root. A pair of strong hands locked around his wrist, and Matthew saw Harold pulling them out of the water. Matthew placed Lindsay on her side and stared at the water flowing out of her mouth. He made sure there was no more water coming out, then flipped her onto her back and placed 2 fingers against her neck. A weak pulse was beating almost undetectable against his fingertips and gave Matthew a ray of hope. He started giving Lindsay chest compressions and artificial respiration. Harold phoned for an ambulance and ran to the road to show them the correct way into the forest. Matthew felt panic flush over the tiny ray of hope. He continued administering CPR whilst practically demanding Lindsay to live. Only when the ambulance arrived did Matthew slow down. The paramedics took over Lindsay and got her into the ambulance. "You'll have to come along as well," said one of the paramedics, and gave Matthew a thick blanket. Now Matthew noticed the cold creeping into his body and the tiredness wearing him out. Harold helped him get into the ambulance and stayed with him all the way to the hospital. Matthew looked helplessly at Lindsay's deathly pale face and felt warm tears stinging in his cold face. At the hospital, Lindsay and Matthew were taken into separate trauma rooms. Matthew was exhausted and fell asleep after a little while, but woke with a start when something grabbed his hand. "How are you feeling?" Harold asked quietly and gave his brother a worried look. "Where's Lindsay?" Matthew asked, sitting bolt upright. Harold sat himself next to Matthew and put his arm around him. "She's on life support. She might survive it or not," he said softly and hugged his brother tightly. Margaret sat beside Lindsay and cried when the door opened. Matthew entered the room and went over to Lindsay. Harold closed the door and stood himself in a corner. "I'm Matthew. I saved Lindsay from drowning in the river and I love her," Matthew explained to Margaret and felt an urge to cry. Margaret got up, went over to Matthew and gave him a big hug. "Thank you so much for getting out of the water," Margaret sobbed before pulling back. She went over to Harold and they stood there conversing silently. Matthew went close to Lindsay and looked at the oxygen tube that had been inserted into her nose. "Lindsay?" Matthew asked hoarsely. Lindsay's eyes fluttered and opened. "Matthew," she whispered, reaching toward him. Matthew grabbed her hand and kissed it. "I'm here. I won't leave you, I promise," Matthew whispered, tears silently rolling down his cheeks. Lindsay drew a gurgling breath and tried to set herself up slightly. "Would you do me a favor?" she whispered. "Anything for you," Matthew whispered back. "Can you hold me, and not just by the hand? I mean, hold me, really hold me next to you," Lindsay said hoarsely before coughing heavily. She heaved for breath and looked at Matthew, tears in her eyes. Matthew looked at her and understood where she was going. Lindsay felt that she didn't have much time left and wanted Matthew with her when she died. Matthew got into the hospital bed and lifted Lindsay into his arms. He held her close and kissed her forehead. Margaret and Harold came over and sat down by the end of the bed. "Margaret, thank you for everything you've given me in life," Lindsay whispered and looked at Margaret. Margaret hugged her sister and cried relentlessly. Harold put his arm around Margaret and looked at Lindsay and Matthew with tears in his eyes. Matthew held Lindsay close to him and gently rocked back and forth. Lindsay dozed off in his arms, but was still breathing, gurgling and heavily. "Promise that you'll never forget me, Matthew," she mumbled and locked her eyes into Matthew's eyes. "I'll never forget, and I will always love you, Lindsay," Matthew replied and kissed her. Margaret and Harold had pulled away to give them some space and were sitting by the wall. Suddenly, Lindsay began coughing violently. Her breath became more strained and she was clawing at her chest whilst she fervently tried taking a breath. Matthew was frightened but held her close. Every chest-heaving cough made Lindsay weaker. Matthew could see that. Finally, Lindsay went quiet and her breathing slowed down. Matthew clutched her even closer and whispered, "Lindsay?" whilst panic manifested itself in him. Lindsay opened her eyes and gave a faint smile. "I love you," Lindsay whispered, drew one faltering breath, breathed out a long, quivering breath. Her eyes were still locked into Matthew's, but now they saw nothing more. They looked like faint stars and yet oddly hazy. Matthew caressed Lindsay's forehead with trembling fingers and stifled the tears and the urge to cry. Margaret cried and held Lindsay when Matthew laid her down and closed her eyes. He began to cry, silently at first, but then he sobbed, and Harold embraced him tightly and gently rocked him. Matthew sank to the floor and cried even harder. There was no comfort in both his brother and Margaret embracing him. Lindsay was buried 3 weeks later. Matthew held a eulogy about his love for Lindsay, and his tears ran shamelessly down his face as he helped carry her white casket out of the church. Margaret walked over and gave Matthew a hug. "You did what you could for Lindsay when you pulled her out of the water," Margaret said. "I promised myself that if I managed to tell Lindsay that I loved her, I would make her the happiest girl in the world. And I think I managed to do so," Matthew replied and wiped away a large tear from his eye. The end. Now, this will be my longest video to date and also my most serious, because I just wanted to get a message, but I have no good way of expressing without almost freezing in front of the camera. So this time I've just filmed a story reading, but I hope this touches you, whoever you are, to watch this video. Listen to what I've read, and please, please remember, bullying is not okay. Bullying can lead to suicidal thoughts or even actual suicides. And 4, if you are bullied, if you see someone get bullied, or if you've bullied someone yourself, please, please stop if you're bullying yourself, or step in to stop bullying. Tell a teacher, tell a parent, stand up for whomever is bullied. Stand up for yourself if you're bullied. Now, I hope that this video has touched you, so you know that bullying can lead to some horrible things. This was a different video, I know, but hopefully a good video. Stay safe and always know that I am sending you a bit of love, so you never have to feel alone. Bye.